Okay, so today we are going to learn how to draw our names in one-point perspective. So the first thing that we're going to do is start with a horizontal line that's going to represent the very top of our letters. Now this can be anywhere you'd really like on your page. You can put it towards the top or the bottom, it does not matter. Slide it right here. I'm just going to draw this line very, very lightly because I'll end up erasing most of it later. Then what I will do is very lightly draw another line a little bit lower, kind of deciding where I want the bottom, the thickness of my letters to go. One thing that I try to do is make sure that I compare the edge of my line to the edge of my piece of paper just to make sure that everything stays nice and square. And I'm going to draw this top line a little bit darker just so you can see it better. Okay. The next thing that I'm going to do is try to figure out the spacing for my letters. If I do my first name, Jenna, I have 5 letters, but I want to have space at the beginning and space in between each letter to make sure there's a gap. If you have a letter like a W or an M, those tend to be a little bit wider than normal letters, so you want to make sure you leave enough room to account for those. I typically like to have about a ½ inch spacing for my letters. So I'm going to start with a little tick mark of a ½ inch across this bottom line just to see if I can fit in all of my letters. So if I do a ½ inch space and then a 1½ inch letter for my J, a ½ inch space, a 1½ inch letter, there's my E, a ½ inch space, a 1½ inch letter, there's my N, a ½ inch space, 1½ inch, there's my other N, a ½ inch space, and then another 1½, there's my A. Now that leaves me with a pretty large gap over here on this end. So what that tells me, I can choose to go back and make my letters a little bit bigger if I want. Try to scooch things down to center them more. So I'm going to erase that first layer of tick marks. And I think I'll make my letters just a little bit bigger to accommodate. So I'll still start with a ½ inch space. But let me try 1 3/4 of an with a 1/4 of an inch with a ½ inch space. So by doing it that way, J, E, N, N, A, that leaves me with much smaller space that's more even and more balanced. Sometimes you'll have to do this a couple of times to figure out the spacing that you need to make sure it'll work. So don't be afraid to erase those tick marks a couple of times and sort of shift things. You want to make sure that you've planned this out pretty well. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is go back where my tick marks are, and I'm going to very lightly bring up vertical lines from them. Make sure they're nice, straight, and vertical. Oh, that first one's a hair crooked. I'm going to straighten that up. And basically box in where my letters are going to go. Creating a nice little box to contain each letter. Do this very quickly. Then I can go back through and erase the extra space, the extra vertical, the extra lines that I don't need, horizontal, in between. So I'm left with just one box for each letter. Now if you do have a letter like an M or a W, you leave extra space for those. If these letters are 1 3/4 of an inch wide, I might leave a gap. I might make my letter for an M or a W maybe 2 inches wide, an extra 1/4 of an inch, just to give it its depth, the width that it needs to look correct once we create these as block letters. Okay, so now I'm left with just my nice 5 boxes ready to go for my 5 letters. So I'm going to create a set thickness for each letter. I'll start with a top bar that I want my J to be. Now blocking in these box letters, you get better at it as you go, but what you want is to create a consistent thickness of line. Erase everything else that you don't need, but that's what my J is going to look like. You want the exterior of this box to be the height and the width and the bottom of your letter. Then you can erase everything to where it is just your box letter. Now I'll do this very quickly for all of my other letters. This is for my E. Now I want to make sure that my letters are consistent, so I'm going to take the height of this bar of the J and use that for my E. And then the same thing at the bottom. This part of the J will become that part of the E. Then in the middle, I can kind of make up what I want it to look like. Again, trying to have about the same thickness for everything. I'm just sort of guesstimating. I can use that part of my J there.